In late 1914, soldiers on the Western Front began digging. What started as temporary shelter hardened into 700 kilometers of trenches from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. For 4 years, millions of men lived inside that earth alongside rats, corpses, and relentless artillery. On a single day, in 1916, 57,000 British soldiers fell. But the real question was never how they died. It was how anyone survived. By the spring of 1915, any hope of a swift mobile conflict vanished. What began as a series of disconnected, muddy ditches dug by soldiers desperate to escape machine gun fire quickly consolidated into a massive, interconnected network of earthworks. This subterranean front cut across the fields of Flanders, down through the Somme, and climbed toward the rugged Vosges mountains. Across this frontier, millions of French, British, Belgian, and German soldiers became citizens of a strange, subterranean world. Instead of grand maneuvers across open territory, military strategy shrank to a fight over yards of mud. The trench became far more than a simple defensive position. It evolved into a permanent, continuous military ecosystem. To stay alive, these men had to adapt to an entirely new way of life where the ground beneath their feet was both their protector and their prison, setting off a daily struggle for basic human survival. For the average infantryman, survival was governed by a relentless, circular calendar. A typical year for a British soldier was carved into strict, repeating shifts. Roughly 70 days in the hazardous front line, 30 days in the support trenches immediately behind, 120 days in reserve, and 70 days of rest, punctuated by just 2 weeks of annual leave. French and German units endured similarly grueling rotations. Regardless of where a battalion stood on the map, every single day in the sector began exactly the same way. In the freezing dark of the pre-dawn hours, the order passed down the line, "Stand to." Soldiers climbed onto the wet wooden fire steps, fixing bayonets and staring out into the misty expanse of no man's land, waiting in the biting cold for an attack that might come with the first light. Once the sun rose, the true test of endurance was the environment itself. The endless thunderous roar of distant artillery served as the permanent soundtrack to their lives, never pausing long enough to allow real sleep. Beneath their feet, the earth crawled. Rats, feeding on waste and corpses, grew to the size of cats, bold enough to run across a sleeping soldier's face. Millions of body lice infested the seams of every wool uniform, causing persistent itching that no amount of washing could cure. Even the most basic human needs became exercises in terror. To use the latrine, men had to navigate shallow, exposed trenches, fully aware that a sniper's bullet could find them at their most vulnerable. Day after day, survival meant enduring these constant, quiet indignities of filth and noise. In the waterlogged clay of Flanders and the Somme, the standing water in the trenches proved just as dangerous as the enemy across no man's land. Prolonged exposure to cold, dirty water and mud caused trench foot, a crippling condition that slowly turned skin red, then blue and eventually black with gangrene. The British Army recorded over 75,000 hospitalizations for this non-combat disability, making it a defining cost of the struggle to stay alive in the mud. To prevent the condition, medical officers ordered men to rub their feet with whale oil and change their socks multiple times a day, but in a flooded trench, dry clothing was an impossible luxury. By 1915, another, more insidious threat began to fill the field hospitals. The term shell shock entered the medical vocabulary to describe men who, despite escaping physical wounds, were entirely broken. Stretcher bearers carrying the wounded away from the front line encountered soldiers who could no longer function. Men shivered uncontrollably, froze in place, or were struck completely mute. A Canadian stretcher bearer recounted carrying men who showed no physical marks of battle, yet their bodies shook so violently they could not stand. An Australian medical orderly noted that others simply stared into space, their minds shattered by the ceaseless heavy artillery. At the time, military authorities rarely viewed these psychological injuries with sympathy. Commanders routinely dismissed shell shock as a sign of weakness, malingering, or cowardice. Many affected soldiers faced disciplinary action, and some were executed for desertion. Today, medical science recognizes these symptoms as severe, post-traumatic stress, but during the Great War, Hundreds of thousands of men were forced to suffer in silence, their invisible wounds treated as a moral failing. In late December 1914, near Ploegsteert, Belgium, the unrelenting violence of the war's first winter paused. Along frozen stretches of the front, soldiers from the British 5th London Rifle Brigade and the German 104th and 106th Saxon regiments began to hear carols drifting across the frozen earth. Spontaneously, men stepped out of their muddy ditches and walked unarmed into no man's land. Enemies met in the open, exchanging cigarettes, sharing photographs, and kicking improvised footballs across the cratered ground. This spontaneous truce remained localized and temporary. In many sectors, the shelling never stopped, and senior commanders on both sides quickly issued strict orders to stamp out any further fraternization. Yet in those quiet pockets of Flanders, the brief ceasefire proved that a shared humanity could survive, even within a vast system designed for mutual destruction. On April 22, 1915, near Ypres, German forces released 150 tons of chlorine gas from thousands of cylinders. The dense yellow-green cloud drifted silently across no man's land, settling deep into the Allied trenches. French, Algerian, and Canadian troops, completely unprepared, inhaled the toxic vapor. The chlorine reacted with moisture in their lungs, creating an acid that caused rapid asphyxiation. In the summer of 1917, a more persistent chemical arrived: mustard gas. This oily agent penetrated wool uniforms, severely blistering the skin, damaging eyes, and burning respiratory tracts. For British, French, Canadian, and Australian soldiers, the earthworks no longer offered refuge. Staying alive now required surviving an enemy that turned the very air they breathed into a weapon. The ultimate test of survival awaited outside the wet earth of the trenches, in the open air above them. Going over the top meant climbing out of protective dirt and running directly into no man's land. Without the shield of sandbags, timber, or deep dugouts, infantrymen faced the full terrifying power of modern weaponry, completely exposed to sweeping machine gun fire on open ground. No battle demonstrated the terror of these tactical assaults more than the Battle of the Somme. On the morning of July 1st, 1916, thousands of British soldiers climbed their trench ladders at 0 hour, carrying heavy packs across a cratered, muddy wasteland. They walked straight into defensive machine gun fire that cut down entire battalions within minutes. By the time the sun set on that single day, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, with over 19,000 dead. It remains the bloodiest day in the history of the British military, a stark measure of industrialized slaughter that marked the absolute limit of human survival on the Western Front. Today, those scarred fields are silent. Yet, that brutal struggle for survival redefined the limits of human endurance, shaping how we understand trauma today. We still live in the shadow of their quiet resilience. Subscribe to help keep these vital stories alive.